So, welcome everybody. This is the latest episode of the Mel Show Podcast. Today we are featuring my guest Shiroe, Strategist Shiroe. Some of you may know him from Krev LM streams or from just hanging out on a variety of other streams, including my own and of course Xenasix Vex. We also will see Shiro from time to time pop up on a variety of different places as well. Shiro's a big fan of the MCU and has probably seen most of the movies more than half of you have seen in your entire lives. That's not really even an understatement.
No, it's really not.
Yeah. So we're gonna do a little bit of a different thing. So since it's almost a month after it released, I'm not going to even bother putting up spoilers, although I'll say it right now. We're going to be going in deep into the Avengers Endgame movie. So if you haven't seen it, probably it's a good time to go see it. But if you don't care about
I'll
that and
say
you've
it in
seen
a
it,
very not nice way here. Listen here, bitches, okay? Plain and simple. You can cut that part out. I don't really care. But if the Russo brothers have said the embargo has lifted, the embargo has lifted. Get over it.
it's fair. I'm not going to cut that. At any rate, so I'll give my initial thoughts on Avengers Endgame. I was excited to see it. It's probably one of the movies. It was actually the first movie I saw this year, um, because in theaters at least, and it was worth the wait. It was worth everything. I saw it, and it didn't disappoint me at all. Um, it wrapped up the story really well. I liked what they did with Captain America. I like how they gave him at least Steve Rogers, the character, a nice send off. I liked the sacrifice that Iron Man made. Of course, with the time travel alternate histories that they created, the alternate timelines that created, really. There is still obviously a way for these characters to return and the actors to return should they decide to in the future. So, that being said, the ultimate conclusion to, I believe this is phase 3, is going to be in Spider Man Far From Home, which will be out, I believe, within the next few months. So, overall, my initial feelings of this was I just loved it. I was in the movie theater. 3 hours went by like it was no time at all, and I could have sat there a couple of more times to watch the movie. Now, in fact, Shiro did, and I know he has a lot more to say on this than I have said, so I'll let him take over for now.
So starting with what Milk said, overall, yeah, I'm echoing a lot of that. I did enjoy the Phase 3 wrap up and the quick TLDR I'm going to give you on Far From Home. It is July 2nd, 2019. To confirm again, that is only in Canada, but it is July 2nd, 2019. As for Endgame as a whole, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I was definitely not overhyped. I did find it to be more of a slow burn, but I enjoyed it given it is the culmination set of everything that has led up to this point for 22 movies over a decade. It was emotional. I am man enough to admit I cried multiple times from multiple emotions, be it sadness, be it happiness, be it pure goddamn excitement at certain points that we'll get into probably a little later when we go in chronological view. Tony's sacrifice was a heavy hitter for me, given he is my favorite character, not only in the MCU as a male protagonist, but same for the comics. Like, I'm very much into technology, so seeing everything culminate as it did for Tony in character development, in story arc, in what the character himself wanted as a whole, just come to fruition in some way, shape, or form until that point, it hit me where I live, plain and simple. Like, that's really hard to not admit. And honestly, I'm proud to admit that. As for Captain America, I don't actively follow him, but I know of him. I know of the radars. And in some of his storylines I've thoroughly enjoyed, such as Civil War, not the movie. Well, yes, the movie, but also the comic set of it up until issue 6, which, if you ask anyone who is big into the Marvel comics, yeah, issue 6 is bad for Civil War. But in Infinity War, we saw a very not, how do I put this? A very forward, ready to go Steve Rogers, like kind of the way he was when he was first becoming Captain America. Like, I know I'm going to get into this fight. I have to get into this fight. And these guys are here with me. I'm going to help them out, even if I don't represent what I represented in before. So seeing him go from that through the loss that was the end of Infinity War with the snap into Endgame and struggling like we see most of our servicemen and servicewomen do after they come back from a war to readjust to society and how it has been is almost heartbreaking. Simply because how do you handle that? Half of the entire population everywhere is gone. And it's essentially your fault. Because you have to remember in Infinity War, he tried. Captain America tried. He held back that snap with Thanos almost to the point of surprise on Thanos' part when you see his face, which I'll get into more later with another military person we have in the Marvel Universe that also heavily surprised Thanos. And I thoroughly enjoy because she, spoiler alert, is my favorite female MCU character. Period. End of discussion. When you reach the end of the Captain America storyline, where he is going to go back in time and return all of the stones, you see a point where Bucky says, "I'm going to miss you, bud." Interestingly enough, it's a lot of people don't see it as a throwback, more as a forward foresight of Bucky knows Steve. He knows Steve isn't coming back. He's going to go live his life. Yeah, think about back to Captain America First Avenger and part of Captain America Winter Soldier and Civil War. I'm with you to the end of the line. It was the literal end of the line. And there's Bucky saying goodbye. A lot of people seem to undervalue that point right there. It was emotional, to say the least, for me. Because you rarely get such a true friendship outside of the movie universe or any other medium that is not real life. So when you have that with somebody and you can see the pure camaraderie, it's not foreign to you, but it's something where you're almost in awe of it. Maybe not all of you, but I know I was. And then we get to the second point of the end of the Captain America storyline, the legacy of Captain America. Captain America is the do right, stand up, to quote, once again, Civil War and the last few words of Peggy Carter to Sharon Carter. If the world asks you to move, you stand in place and say, no, you move. That's pretty big to say. But then when you think about how Captain America has always approached everything, from being the scrawny kid in New York to I can do this all day long, to Captain America himself standing up to Thanos, holding that gauntlet, squeezing with every inch of his power while on one knee to prevent doomsday from happening. He should have honestly said, I can do this all day. And that would have been almost a comedy relief break in there, which would have been okay. I would have been fine with it. I think it would have been worthwhile. It moves on. Well, how do you keep that legacy going? There's nobody like Captain America. There's nobody that purely embodies that sense of self and almost an entire country's belief in what that country is and what it stands for, which I'm not going to get into the political side of that. As Milk knows, I can go very heavily on that because I love Aaron Sorkin's The Newsroom.
Yeah, well, we'll stay out of that for this.
Yeah, for sure. You get into, well, no one can step into those shoes, just like no one could step into Tony's shoes. Flip to the comics for a second. Well, Tony died multiple times in the comics and people stood up. We had Iron Lad, which a lot of people, if you paid attention at Tony's funeral, there was somebody there where you're like, okay, well, there's Happy, there's Morgan, there's Pepper. Hey, everybody's here. And then there's somebody where you're like, well, who's that? Who's that guy standing alone? Like, who's that teenage kid? Who the hell is he? He is the kid from Iron Man 3, whose name escapes me right now. But to sum it up for you, the kid that Tony went through most of the story with to find out, like, yeah, I'm the mechanic, I fix things. It was him. And a lot of people are foreshadowing, well, that kid's going to be Iron Lad. I don't see them bringing Iron Lad in, truth be told. I am more of the idea that you have in the comic universe Ironheart, which is a female superhero by the name of Riri Williams, who is a African American MIT college student that is much younger, like Tony was when he went to MIT. And she was smart enough, like Tony, to, after seeing the Iron Man suit and seeing him fly around and save the world and being inspired like all kids are inside of a comic universe, I want to do that too. And she did. She flat out stole parts from all over MIT and built her own janky Iron Man suit, which caught the attention of Tony before he passed away, slash died into a coma of things that I'll get into whenever Melk decides to pull me on for a comic run. But Tony wasn't in his own body, so to speak, but he had an AI replica of his brain created, much like Friday, for Riri. So he could mentor her to not become the next Iron Man, but to become the next Iron superhero. And I'm foreseeing that, like much other people are, with Morgan, Tony's child. If you remember the not full start of Endgame, but partway through when we cut to them coming to Tony 5 years later, we see Morgan come out of her little fort, and she is wearing that blue and gold helmet. Rescue's helmet, to be precise, which is Pepper Potts' iron suit. And I'll get into a tangent on her later when we get further into the Woman of Power section of the movie. But think about that for a second. She comes out in that. You think it's not a big deal. It's cute, but it's not a big deal. Tony, you really love playing with your mom's stuff, don't you, kid? You really love wearing your mom's stuff, don't you, kid?
Well, I'm actually gonna cut in here and say that this is not stuff that, like, I'm not reading into this from the comics. I'm reading into this from Kevin Feige's perspective. What they're doing here and what the Russo brothers are doing, and they've been doing it masterfully since like Winter Soldier, I believe, is
Pretty much
planting seeds down for, let's say, Phase 5, Phase 6. Getting away from Iron Man for a few minutes, because yeah, it is about Iron Man, and it is about Captain America, and they're very big parts of it. And it really is the culmination of their stories. It's also dropping hints to Ant-Man's daughter becoming another superhero, who is another superhero in the comics. It's also there's a lot of seeds that are planted into things that are going on. And I think a lot of people, like now we're going to get the new Guardians of the Galaxies featuring Thor. Then we're going to be moving away from Thor individual movies and moving to the next Guardians movie that they've already probably started writing, at least since they brought James Gunn back. Is Thor's going to be a character in the Guardians movies now going forward?
You need to stop pronouncing it wrong.
I know what it is. Go ahead and say it.
As Guardians of the Galaxy.
Right. But I mean, that's coming up. That's already been hinted at for Phase 4. Spider-Man, they've already pretty much announced that a lot of that was going to be happening. But see, one of the things that we're forgetting is that there's something else that's coming up that's going to be introduced. Like Spider-Man Homecoming represents the true ending to the MCU as we know it, in terms of the characters that have already been established. There were a number of seeds that were already planted in previous, like Guardians 2, where we still don't know what's happening with Adam Warlock. That was a seed that was dropped at the end of the movie in a post-credit scene that will probably play a big part in Phase 3, in Phase 4, and going forward. And of course, as we'll get into a little bit more with Captain Marvel, the Skrulls are probably going to be another thing, and I'm going to guess that the next phase is going to be leading up to the Secret Wars, which is probably the next major event they're going to cover. If they're going to cover an event, that would make sense to build up to that. And I'm really thinking about this in terms of the fact that now that it's been confirmed and approved, we are going to get X-Men movies. We are going to get Deadpool as Deadpool, which Disney has already confirmed to be a part of the MCU, except that when he's doing the Avengers crossovers, they'll tone him down to a little bit more PG-13 lines. But they've already confirmed that we're getting Fantastic Four, which is a big part of the Marvel Universe, going back to all of this. These are characters that were missing, but are now coming forward. And there's probably a few others that I'm forgetting. I don't know what they're doing with Ghost Rider, but all of their characters, their licenses are slowly coming back to them, which means that this is going to be an expanding endeavor as we go forward. And these are all going to be new things that were new heroes, new characters, new teams that we're going to be factoring into this.
Actually, I believe they've all officially come back in some fashion since the Fox purchase, to be precise.
Well, they haven't.
They still got the Spider ones technically through how Sony said the agreement went through.
Well, Fox Spider-Man's owned by Sony right now. The rights are owned by Sony, and Sony's not giving up all of the Venom rights or all those things. So right now they've only got a permission to use Spider-Man, but since they're making a lot of money, I can't imagine that that will continue to just be permission to use, because none of their Sony movies have done as well as any of the MCU movies. Because they just don't have the tie-ins, and nor have they had really the successful amount of people to write, the people that have actually should have been writing the movies that Marvel has had, to be fair.
It's hard to beat it when it comes to anything.
Let's be honest. We've seen what happens when the X-Men Origins Wolverine movie writer takes over writing for Game of Thrones season 8. That's been a disaster. So let's just feel better that a lot of this is resting in the hands of more competent and capable writers.
Yeah, well, the Game of Thrones writers are going to want to start writing movies, right?
God knows whatever they do. Good luck to them. They kind of dropped the ball, but that's a different podcast. But yeah, I mean, like I think that there's a lot going on, but I think we're seeing more in the lines of now them expanding into. I mean, look, Captain Marvel was by far, I think, in terms of being enjoyable, as far as a Marvel movie goes, it's been Captain Marvel stands, as far as I'm concerned, is right up there with Wonder Woman, if not better in many ways, because of just the amount that the content that we're seeing. I prefer Marvel content over DC content.
Likewise, and obligatory, my girl Carol. oh, that was the first movie of 2019 that I saw, was Captain Marvel. I could go into a whole tangent on that. I won't, for the sake of the time of this.
Well, we can come back to that in another podcast and talk a little bit more about the significance of we can talk about the significance of. I would like to do one actually talking about the significance of Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman in regards to portraying actual, female heroine, heroes on the screen, because both of those movies did excellent jobs of it. And I mean, Wonder Woman does stand out as a kind of a gem among the DC movies, because most of the rest of them have been kind of garbage.
You mean the foundation of the DC movies?
Yeah.
So if I had to take a very short phrase to culminate how to describe Endgame to anybody wanting to understand the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I would call it the conclusion of the default Avengers, or Wave 1 Avengers, as a lot of people also know them. Because if you look at, again, back to the comics, you have the Avengers. Then you have the Mighty Avengers, the New Avengers, the Uncanny Avengers, and we are leading into some of those, which is nice because it's the alternative teams.
You also have the Secret Avengers.
Yep, there's so many Avenger types.
Oh yeah,
because there's West Coast too. There's Great Lakes Avengers, which is the Canadian version, which is not the same as the Canadian team Alpha Flight, which I'm hoping we'll see with the rumored Captain Marvel 2, which should be short-haired Carol in space, hopefully, but we'll see.
I do expect we'll see that.
And speaking of female superhero movies, we do have a confirmed Black Widow movie coming eventually in Phase 4 at some point.
Well, we have to wait for them. I believe they'll do that either at that announcement should be at Comic-Con this year for the next
That's my guess as
upcoming
well.
phases, because Marvel has always had a big presence there, so I'm expecting to see that there. I'm expecting to see them announce like the rest of the beginning of Phase 4 and most of the movies. I would say going to, so let's say 2020, going to probably 2022, 2023. I do think we're going to be a ways off from seeing the. I mean, I would say, what would your guess as to the next Avengers movie being? I mean, I would say safely like 2023 would be the next time we would see one.
I would say 2023, and my current prediction now, given that we do have War Machine, we have Scarlet Witch, we have Captain Marvel, we have Spider-Man, we have a lot of the members, and we will be getting Wolverine. It's been confirmed there's a new Wolverine coming. So I am seeing a lot of big red flags, as I'm going to call it, or signposts, whatever you want to say. But I prefer big red flags because I'm kind of weird. It is the Mighty Avengers.
Hmm. I can see that. Um, I do want to say that I've also heard about Wolverine. I've also heard rumors. Now, this is actually from some of the studio execs, that there is a chance that since they have alternate timelines now, that Hugh Jackman could be making cameos throughout this.
Would not surprise me. With the right, this is where I believe that the right amount of money can technically bring anybody back to a.
Well, I mean, it's not just the money; it's also the fact that like the X-Men, as it was the original, I would say the original three X-Men movies, because Logan, as it stands, is actually a standout from the Fox days. Logan was an excellent film that was very much more in the vein of, I would say, the Dark Knight, rather than, let's say, the original X-Men movies. If just by the feel and the grit of it.
It was a very gritty, and I'm gonna say somber kind of styled Marvel movie, unofficial Marvel movie, technically, if you want to say that, since it's not in the MCU. But it was extremely enjoyable for what it was. If you look at it either as the complete standalone or the ending of the Wolverine trilogy.
Well, I mean, I'm looking at it just as a film that stands out above itself, because most of their other films, with the exception of Deadpool, were, I would say, watchable, but not necessarily like, they weren't films that were destination films. They were blockbusters. Sure, you would go see them. They were fun to watch. They weren't garbage. I'm not talking about some of the newer ones, like the one where they had. We're not going to go into any of the ones with like the New Class Forward, because those were there were a lot of things that were wrong with those. But
It was a lot of those, I would say, were discount movie day movies. They were
yeah,
enjoyable at the cheaper price.
it was like they had the license, and they had to make a movie to continue having the license, like they did with the Fantastic Four when they rebooted that, and that was utterly garbage. Yeah, that's why I'm excited to see what with the MCU having the Fantastic Four and the X-Men. I'm excited to see good, like really good stories, and really like good things being pulled from the comics, from the primary source documents, going into that, and that being injected into the greater MCU overall, which will only make the universe that much bigger. And even if they do like branch out stories where like they do another big Avengers film, they don't necessarily have to have groups like the X-Men or the Guardians of the Galaxy, or the as Guardians of the Galaxy, as you would say, uh, put into them, to have references thrown into them, because now they could reference things like they've done in the comics. Well, remember this event from over here, and that ties into maybe if they build up another, like want to build up another big thing. Although I think the Avengers is always going to be like the flagship movie. Which overall, I mean, leading into something, I think one thing that we're both forgetting to kind of do at the moment, or maybe putting off doing, is thinking about what a cinematic achievement this actually is. I mean, think about this. We're talking about movies that started over 10 years ago now with Iron Man, and that have managed to weave threads of a story together, growing with each movie, adding to the mythology that they were building, into the story that they were
Mhm.
building. And ultimately building up to what was essentially the culmination of, I mean, we're talking about over 22 movies.
We are talking about exactly 22 movies, if I recall
Well,
my count correctly.
yeah,
But either way, you are absolutely correct. It is something that I would say is extremely underplayed for an achievement as a whole, because when you really look at it, even if, let's say, you didn't enjoy Captain Marvel, for an example, because you found Brie Larson's acting was flat and emotionless, that was part of the character. I mean, think about it this way. You've lived in your house for, let's say, 30 years, right? But
Mhm.
you have no memory of living in that house. You have no attachment to it. If it burnt down, you'd be like, oh, that's kind of bad. Okay. But then if all those memories came flooding back while it's on fire, you'd be freaking out and trying to put that fire out. So that's understandable. But let's also say you didn't enjoy Ant-Man and the Wasp because it's Ant-Man. It's another heist movie. It still had a fair amount of good money tied to it. It got a lot of good investment return. It was moderately well paced, in my opinion, albeit not one of my favorites of the MCU. But none of these movies, I will say, fell flat on their face. Of all 22, not a single one did that. They all got a good amount of value, a good amount of return value, both for audience and for studio. And as a whole, it still continued the story, it continued to build the world, and added some form of value towards this ending that we now have. That is extremely hard to pull off for just even a good trilogy, let alone what is dodeca is 12, so a dodeca trilogy, whatever you want to call it.
Well, at this point, we just call it a compendium because that's literally
That works
let's
perfectly
let's
fine for me.
let's take the comic book thing. This is a compendium of movies that has become like the first of its kind in cinema, in cinematic history. Like before this, let's look at the achievements that were before this. Really, I mean, the longest series of films that you had prior to this weren't even Star Wars films. I mean, Star Wars is now sitting at what, 8 films?
8
10,
with 9 coming in December.
well, okay, 8
Not counting
mainline films,
US
not counting Rogue One and the Solo story.
Correct.
So we could say 10 films, resulting in an 11th film, and we don't know what they're doing after that. But then we would have to look at really what the Lord of the Rings. There's 6 films in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which probably come close to equaling 22 hours or 22 movies worth of film, given how much Peter Jackson overfilmed.
And depending on which version of which Lord of the Rings movie you watch.
Exactly. But I mean, those were, in and of itself, at the time, I would say The Lord of the Rings was a tremendous achievement because of just the way they filmed it, how they edited, and just the sheer amount I mean, the time that they filmed that was really a changing point in cinema history. It was before we had Iron Man, and it was right before we got the and I would say probably the more, because like here's the thing, and in my opinion, and tell me if you agree with me on this. The first really commercially successful comic book films that we got were X-Men, the original X-Men, and Spider-Man, but done by the Sam Raimi.
Yep,
After
I'd agree
that,
with that so far.
After that, like we really had like Spider-Man 2 was still decent before 3 got, I would say, overdone. And, again, X-Men 2, X2 and then X3, of course, again, I think was kind of where, again, we started to see a decline in the quality of those films as well. But then
I'd also agree.
we didn't really get any solid comic book films up until really Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, because that trilogy, just by Chris Nolan, I think that Dark Knight Rises got overshadowed by real life with the shooting that happened on opening weekend. But
unfortunately, yes, but I would also agree that is probably one of the best comic book movies pre-cinematic universe era that we got, period.
And that's
not
why,
just because of Heath Ledger.
No, but I mean, like, just overall, the casting was good, the writing was solid, the stories were good, the characters were engaging, you cared about what happened. And it wasn't something that felt like a comic book movie. I mean, as much as I want to say it, they felt the Dark Knight source material, the Dark Knight trilogy, was more taken from the Dark Knight comic, which was darker and definitely had a more realistic tone to it than, you know, any of the movies that came like prior to that, like prior to Spider-Man and X-Men. We hadn't had a good comic book movie, good faithful adaptation, which was a comic book movie since 1989's Batman with Michael Keaton as Batman. That
Yeah,
was,
about that.
I mean, let's be fair. I mean, that was actually, and to be fair, if people may say, well, look at how it was filmed. It was actually very close to the original comics. It was actually the Joker character was close to the original comics. There was and Michael Keaton was a uh, very good in both sides of the character of Batman. So yeah, I mean, I have to say, like up and up, but then we had that long period of time before Spider-Man and X-Men, and then when again after those films started to decline, we had another period, but not as long because once the Nolan films came out, they reinvented Batman, they rebooted the series, they gave us 3 solid films that really told a good story, and whether you like the ending or not doesn't really matter. I mean, to be honest, it wasn't a bad ending. I didn't think it was a bad ending. I know some people may disagree, and that's fine. But really, it wasn't until Iron Man that we got a real, true, honest to God, as good as the comics, and that was the first one I would say that we had since Batman in 1989.
Yeah, because I mean, I'd have to agree completely with that, if only because I can't count the George Clooney Batman movie as a proper Batman movie. And that's not because of the anatomically correct nipple suits. It's not because of Arnold's bad acting as Mr. Freeze. It's not because of the bad writing alone. Like, there was too much wrong with it as a whole.
Well, I mean, George Clooney, Val Kilmer, they all got it wrong after Michael Keaton. Michael Keaton, I think, still as Batman, even though I was not as much of a fan as Batman Returns, I did still enjoy the it was still the same. It was like it felt the same as the first. It had that similar kind of feeling to it. I think that the Penguin was definitely the creepiest version of the Penguin ever.
That was a good job, though, in my
Oh, it was
opinion, for
absolutely.
playing a political version of the Penguin.
Danny DeVito did a fantastic job of that. I mean, you wouldn't even know it was Danny DeVito by just looking at the character. They did such a fantastic job, and he did a fantastic job portraying. Don't get me wrong, I'm just saying, but it was definitely that there was this unease about the character that was so beautifully done that we really didn't see anything of that quality. And see, that's what I'm saying. It's like when Favreau and Kevin Feige came together and they put this thing together. It's like they looked at what had come before and said, what worked, what didn't, and how do we plan this to be big? And then they looked at the actual source material and treated it with so much reverence and respect that they pulled off something, like I said, that's absolutely has not been topped. That is a first in the history of film. Which is why I'm going to go ahead, and I usually don't care about awards, but I would be really annoyed if they didn't nominate Endgame for some sort of Academy Award just for the simple achievement of what they accomplished.
Yeah, I definitely hop on board with that kind of annoyance. And to jump back, I'll say one boxcar of the train real quick here, is that when you look at a lot of movies, not just comic book movies, not just the horrid atrocity that has been any video game movie, movies as a whole, anything that has some kind of source material to reference, if you respect it properly and integrate it correctly with the proper kinds of input from either the creator if you can, or just the medium it was with and how it was and how that would transition to the screen, you can do a good job. And what I'm going to point to as my example of how not to do something like that is going to be the movie I almost never try to say a name to, which is Avatar: The Last Airbender with M. Night Shyamalan. Because that is how you look at the source material, throw it in a dumpster, and say, I can do better.
And we all know how
Feige
bad that
refuses
turned
to
out.
do it. The fact that Feige refuses to do that and will say, no, let's take another look. There's got to be a better way for this is almost awe-inspiring in a way for me.
Well, I mean, there's an interesting parallel I want to draw here. It's that Kevin Feige took over the Marvel property when Disney and as Disney's handpicked guy to run that. He's the showrunner of sorts. Just like they picked Kathleen Kennedy, although Kathleen Kennedy did come over from under Lucas. It's just that I think Kevin Feige was more one to adhere to what had come before because he could see what it represents and the value of it. Whereas I understand that Kathleen Kennedy, now believe it or not, she's been with Lucas for a very long time and she'd been with the films. A lot of people want to give her flack because of what happened with The Last Jedi. And I think part of that comes from Rian Johnson wanting to kind of play in the sandbox and make a film that he really wanted to see. And I'm not going to I'm not going to bash The Last Jedi or anything like that, but you can see where the way they treat the source material differs from how the films how the films wound up coming out at the end and the reception that the fans and the community gave them.
Oh, yes.
Now, again, and I really want to take some of the political stuff out there. I don't want to get into all the allegations of SJW, social justice warrior stuff, getting into things.
Yeah, no, I'm not going there.
Because, look, at the end of the day, one thing I want to say about Marvel films, and one thing I always like when I would go to see these films is seeing the amount of people from all age groups going in there, families going in there. It's one of the only films out there that you can have always been films that they have released as far as the MCU where you could take your kids and you could share something that maybe you experienced as a kid in the comics with a new generation, and they would grow up and now they want to read about things. So maybe you have little girls growing up wanting to be the next Iron Man or wanting to be the next superhero. And I think that's such a wonderful thing to have because a lot of stuff that comes out. One thing I have to say is the Marvel movies for me have always been a way that when I need a break from reality for a couple of hours, I can go and just have a great adventure, watch a great adventure, and experience it through the eyes of some of these characters that are doing these fantastic and wonderful things on the screen, and just get that bit of innocence back from when I was a child.
I can wholeheartedly agree with that. And if I had to throw one more person into the mix for parallels of how to learn and better yourself from things in the terms of content creation, be it in this medium or in a TV medium of the type, I'm going to put Dave Filoni up on that roster list as a writer and producer. He worked with Lucas heavily for the CGI style animated Star Wars The Clone Wars, which is coming back. I can't wait for that. And then took everything he learned when he got on board with Disney and made Star Wars Rebels that I thoroughly enjoyed. And he respected everything that came before it for Star Wars while creating another section of that world that we all wanted to see.
And I think I agree with you. And I think we probably should consider doing another podcast because one thing I'll say about this, just to give it a little bit of a hint of what we can talk about on that is literally when you watch the prequels, a lot of it is a lot of story condensed into what would be acceptable for films. So I think those films capped that at about 2 hours and 15 minutes to 2 hours and 2.5 hours for the longest one. And a lot of it was truncated. Like I felt that those movies could have actually been a little bit longer and would have done a little bit more justice to the story that Lucas was trying to condense into this because of the political overtones that he was putting in from, with all the stuff that was going on behind the scenes and of course all the action and everything else. I think that they were actually a little bit too short. But I think that the characters also, as a result of having so much story crammed into that, you didn't get a chance to really develop that attachment to those characters as you did in the original trilogy. Whereas Clone Wars gave you the experience. They gave you those characters. They fleshed out Anakin's character. He wasn't a whiny bitch in the Clone Wars. You actually cared about his character. Same thing with Obi-Wan Kenobi. He wasn't just somebody that got like was it a Mary Sue that they call them? But he was
Excuse me, he is Sassmaster 3000 in the Clone Wars, not
but
the movie.
in the Clone Wars, he's fantastic. They really fleshed out those characters some more so that you understand what they're going through and the storylines. And Filoni did an amazing job with that. And for some of the things, I know a lot of people had the problem with Ezra as a character in the first series, but he was a kid, and you have to take him as a kid and understand that he is a kid who didn't grow up, didn't have parents around for a while, didn't have a family around, so he's going to come off as a spunky, pain in the ass. But that's how kids at his age are. And they did a great job with developing his character and the whole thing with, I mean, I'm not going to talk about how it ended because there were many times towards the end of Rebels that I legit cried because of things that were going on with the characters. But again, it gave you that heart and soul that you need when you dealing with source material that people care about. And that's the thing that I really feel came through, because I'll tell you now, going into spoiler territory, when Cap is standing there with Thanos at the end of Endgame before the on your left moment,
Oh, fuck that moment.
yeah, you know that we're all sitting there looking at this, and Cap's looking at this, and of course he says, "I could do this all day." And he straps on the broken shield, and he's getting ready. We know at that point, a lot of people, I think, figured that that was the moment that Cap was going to die, because we were told that Cap was not coming back.
I
Before.
totally thought that.
But then when you hear the on your left, and then you just see all of the Doctor Strange portals opening, and you see everybody coming through, and everybody's been brought back, of course, by the Hulk snap, that there was that moment in the theater where I remember clearly everybody cheered. Everybody cheered. Everybody was applauding. Everybody was happy. And, I remember for me, that moment it was, it brought a tear to my eye because of just the spectacle of what I was seeing. Which is what, for me, going to see a movie like this is about. A big epic movie. There's always that moment where you're getting to the climax, that final battle, and then all of a sudden all the participants or all the actors are on the stage, so to speak. And it's that moment, like, for me, that I hadn't had since Return of the King with the Battle of Pelennor Fields and the Last Ride of the Rohirrim.
For sure.
Where, he's given that speech, and then the camera pulls back in that pan, and you just see the army that is the Rohirrim, the 7,000 or 8,000 strong, and just the hundreds of thousands of what do you call it? The bad guy. I'm gonna call it
Uruk-hai.
Yeah, Uruk-hai, and under the Uruk-hai, the orcs, the actual orcs, and everything else. These were, and all of their Eastern allies and everything else. And you just see that charge in, and the music comes up, and you're just like, it's just such a spectacle, and you're just watching this and everything that happened. And it was like, for me, that was one of the pinnacles in my film going, for all the years that I've been going to see films, because that was, and and of course it's fantasy. I could talk about the difference, obviously, between the feeling I got when I watched Saving Private Ryan in the theater for the first time, and I'm seeing, as a World War II historian and somebody that studied that, watching what was essentially war footage being recreated on screen and just seeing the utter horror of real war. That was something else, but I couldn't compare it to that because that was a different feeling I got. That was a feeling of deep sorrow for what people had to endure for our freedoms.
Indeed.
Whereas I'm looking at the Battle of Pelennor Fields as this is just spectacle. It's a good movie, popcorn material. But as I'm watching this thing in Endgame, I'm like, oh my God, this is fantastic. And then you get caught up with the audience and everything that people are feeling. And you're like, this is the greatest thing I've seen. And it was that payoff. I think it was the moment that was the payoff for everything they had been working for in the film, where all of a sudden everybody's back. And now we get this real, like, and it's also worth it for that look on Thanos' face where it's like, well, shit.
I'm going to go one further and say that point in time was not the precise moment where I felt that wave of change. That's where if you've stood in front of the ocean during like tide change and you can feel that kind of cool salty breeze come in and you see the waves start coming a little bit further and then a little bit further. That's how I felt when I saw the portals open. And then the second that you see Cap fucking stick out that right hand and in comes Mjolnir, Avengers, and right there is where you feel that spark hit and you know there's that big wave coming. That means the tide is officially here. Assemble. Because we've been waiting since the first movie for that. Because we knew at some point, at any point, if this entire cinematic universe fell apart, that one line would feel cheapened and probably a cop out to try and keep us emotionally tied. And instead, it was probably the most invested emotional payoff of any cinematic universe moviegoers. I'm going to call it a career.
Well, I like the fact that it was a call. I mean, I agree with you entirely. Don't get me wrong. But I like the fact that they planted the seeds for that moment in Age of Ultron.
Oh, for sure.
Like that party scene where Thor's actually watching Cap like budge Mjolnir, and then to see that payoff and to see that come out was absolutely phenomenal.
Which also shows, in my opinion, a lot of character development, because a lot of people have theorized that in that Age of Ultron moment, Cap, yes, he budged the hammer, but he chose not to lift it. I believe that Mjolnir found the worth within Cap, but there was still the weight of things afterwards that we saw within Civil War, of him knowing about Bucky being framed, him knowing about Bucky killing Stark's parents, that weighed on him just enough that it's like, you're 99.9% worthy there, Steve. Come on, buddy.
Yeah.
And if you think afterwards, it's like, hey, we're past that point. Now he's worthy.
Yeah. But also, I think not only that, but also the fact that we know that Cap at that point was so willing to sacrifice everything that he had. And we've known that since the beginning about him. But it was also, I think, the fact that I think that Civil War and that poster that they had for it with Iron Man versus Captain America, it was just epitomized the story that we were getting into. It started with Iron Man and it started with Cap. I'd love to say it started with Hulk, because Hulk was technically the second movie in the series. Incredible Hulk, not Hulk, Incredible Hulk. Although, interesting point, Incredible Hulk did reference a number of times the Eric Bana Hulk movie.
You're talking about the 2008 Hulk, which I believe was the Incredible Hulk one, yes, with Thornton?
With Norton, Ed Norton.
Edward Norton.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Ed Norton's Incredible Hulk was part of the MCU at that time, but they had just worked out the deal for that. And I forget how they did that or how that happened. There was some things involved, but they weren't sure on how. But once Iron Man did as well as it did, they actually agreed to film the post-credit scene, tying that into the whole thing.
That movie was a lot of people are going to call it an unofficial part of the MCU, myself included, for the longest time. The more I go back and rewatch it, the more I appreciate that for what it was. And I would not have minded seeing him as Bruce Banner Hulk mix for the actual MCU. Not that Mark Ruffalo hasn't done a good job. I have always enjoyed how he has acted so far.
Yeah, I just think the problem was, I mean, this is, and I have nothing against Ed Norton, but I've heard a lot of things that he's not the easiest actor to work with. And I think that's one of the reasons that he wound up not going over.
I can see that.
Because he did want there were a lot of stuff came up from after the production of that film that said he wanted more creative control over things, and that wasn't going to work for Disney and for what they were trying to achieve with him trying to stick his nose in. Now, granted, Ed Norton, I think, is a phenomenal actor. I think is a tremendous talent. I've always enjoyed his films. But I can see where they would have a problem with somebody doing that, and I think that's why he didn't get picked to go in that. The irony is, I know that he and Mark Ruffalo are actually good friends in real life.
I'm not surprised by that.
But I mean, I'm glad to see that. Well, I mean, look, we've also developed, over the years we've developed a lot of connections to these characters that have been portrayed. There are friends. we know we're going to see them multiple times during the year. I look forward every year to what Marvel movies coming out. That usually gets put on my calendar. So, I mean, to say that, like you said earlier, there hasn't been one of these films that has flopped. There, and I don't think going forward that there will ever be one of these. Well, no, I won't say ever, but maybe I just don't see that happening because they've put so much care into it. They've put so much
Yeah, no,
painstaking effort into this that there's even now, I'm sure even now looking into, Endgame set up so many seeds, but even in the more recent films like, Black Panther last year and Ant-Man and the Wasp, they set up so many seeds for movies to come, going back to 2017 with Guardians 2 setting up the Adam Warlock, for the future. And then of
which I'm still
course,
surprised
yeah,
we haven't seen.
especially considering, yeah, I know, but I am excited because I do believe that the Secret Wars is going to be the next thing, and that was something that did come out in the late '80s. I remember a friend of mine collecting all these Secret Wars crossover comics and having them. In fact, I was talking to him; he still has all those comics. So, like I had the original Infinity Gauntlet series that came out,
Yeah,
and I'm like, oh, I'm glad I kept these in mint condition. But I mean, these are things that I'm looking forward to seeing in the future, and I believe that what they're doing here is something that will continue to pay out in spades for them.
there may be a bit of recession in, we'll say, attendance numbers, but I don't see it being deal breaking.
Well, I mean, one of the things a few people have said is like, this is a good stepping off point for people too. Like if you've kind of gotten to your fill, this is the big spectacle movie. Maybe you go see Spider-Man Far From Home. I think a lot of people are going to go see Spider-Man Far From Home.
I
I think
do for
that's
sure.
I think that it's going to be bigger than people project it will be because of just the impact that Endgame had on people. I think that there are going to be a lot of people that are going to want to go and get that last bit of closure for this particular phase. And I think that the other thing I would say is like a lot of people have said this because I was having a conversation at one of the comic stores. This is a stepping off for people that are maybe a little bit burnt out on superhero films because there have been a lot of them. I mean, and there have been a lot of stuff on all of the streaming networks and on TV as well. I mean, there's superheroes everywhere you look now.
Yep.
And this would be a good stepping off point for people who need a break for a while and maybe, it's like, well, there's not going to be another big Avengers event or nothing, or maybe now that Iron Man's gone, I can take a break because he was my favorite character and whatnot. But I think there's another thing is this is a great stepping on point for a lot of people that are coming into it too, because any one of these films could be your entry point to this universe and to seeing a bunch of stuff. And then of course having all of these things now, I mean, one of the greatest things is when Iron Man came out, DVD and Blu-ray were still major things. Think
For
about it
sure.
now, everything is all that, everybody can get it on Amazon or streaming services that they have it or Netflix, and you can get these for things at your, you know, if I wanted to go and watch, let's say I hadn't seen Iron Man 2, I could get it within 2 minutes of us having this conversation. I could be watching Iron Man 2 on any one of these Netflix or Google Play or whatever services.
Or my media server if it wasn't dead.
Yeah. but yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that's so great about where we when the time that we are living in, that we can go back and have these and relive these experiences and relive these journeys anytime we want. And that's one of the things I think, as somebody that grew up in the 80s and did not have the ready accessibility of all the media, it's still something to see. Again, I have a unique perspective. I grew up with video games when video games were like the height of technology when I was a kid was like blocky characters that were stick figures running across the screen on my 2600 versus now being involved in tremendous immersive worlds with lore that goes back. I mean, look at games like Final Fantasy 14. Look at games like World of Warcraft.
Oh God, please.
These are games that have like 20, 30 years almost of history now. and that have these universes that are huge and sprawling and just as much lore. So to have something like this in film is also a unique experience. To have this 10 years of lore, these 22 movies, again, like that's one of the things I loved about Endgame. And I think for me, if I had to say the part where I really got choked up was the end scene with Cap and dancing, where he was dancing. That was probably the one that got me
Which,
choked
yeah,
up. Huh?
a little bit, yeah. Seeing him actually there with Peggy Carter in a family environment. Like that's one of those have your cake and eat it too moments that are so rare in life. You know what I mean?
Yep. So that was like for me. I think that's where I kind of my overall opinion of Endgame was when I walked out of that theater and when I got up that night and I just walked outside and it was a nice day and I was like I felt like something had I knew I had seen something amazing and I felt like satisfied. For the first time I really
That's a
want to
good word
say
for it.
I felt satisfied coming out of a movie. I didn't feel like there was stuff that could have changed. Yeah, I could nitpick, but really I felt overly utterly satisfied. The irony for me was when I walked out of the theater, it was 7 o'clock on that Sunday night of opening weekend, and 2 hours later, Game of Thrones, the longest night, the big Winterfell battle
Yeah, their
scene
battle.
aired, and that was an hour and a half, and I was sitting there, and it's very hard to appreciate anything I was seeing on screen. But I didn't have a problem with the darkness. I knew it was going to be a night fight, but it was very hard for me to have a full appreciation for that, having just watched Endgame and seeing a battle that basically dwarfed that by a long shot.
But if you'll agree with me on this, being one of the people who did see Game of Thrones versus me who doesn't see Game of Thrones. That weekend as a whole was one of the most emotionally draining weekends probably in the history of modern day society
Well, I want to
for
say
most
this.
people.
There's one thing I want to say specifically for anybody that's in geek or gaming culture. The other thing that was great about that weekend was that was the pre-release for War of the Spark, where
Exactly,
we
for Magic
we
the
for
Gathering.
anybody that plays Magic the Gathering, that was an event in and of itself. And for anybody that follows the lore of the Magic the Gathering, we know that people got chewed up in that too. Some of our favorite characters got chewed up and killed in that experience too. So, like going forward from that, that was a tremendously unique weekend in geek culture overall because in gaming you have this big expansion that is probably one of the most overhyped sets I've ever seen that lives up to the hype, but it's also one of the most powerful sets to come out in a good almost 9 years
Yeah.
since the Scars of Meriden block, to be followed immediately on to have that on the same day as like this culmination of cinema, like cinematic history with Endgame, and then to top that off with probably one of the most anticipated fight scenes in television history on Game of Thrones. You're talking about like just the perfect storm of pop culture that happened that weekend.
For
And
sure.
I think the culmination was, I mean, I know talking to people that own stores, game stores made a killing that weekend. And then, like, I think when they closed, everybody went to go see Avengers Endgame. And we know that that broke box office records like all day long. And then just to have that culminate into like possibly one of the most watched episodes in TV history. Generally speaking, that weekend alone was like like a whirlwind of emotion for many different people. But I think wherever you stood, whether you went to see Endgame, which I mean, to be fair, looking at the sales figures, I don't know who didn't, um, or whether you were a Game of Thrones fan or not, you were having some sort of emotional experience that weekend.
Yep, for me, the heaviest point going back to Endgame in this tangent that I've been taking on is seeing the point of everybody returns and Thanos is standing on one side of the field, they're all standing on the other, everybody else goes to charge in, and then all of a sudden all you hear is something just entered the atmosphere. And I'm like, oh man, here she comes. And my friend Rachel, right beside me, starts hitting me on the shoulder, knowing Carol's my girl, and here she comes. And I'm gonna put it simple. To quote Miley Cyrus, she came in like a fucking wrecking ball.
You know, I was waiting for her to show up the entire site, and when she showed
You
up,
see her go toe to toe with Thanos to the point that not only is there a bit of fear in his eyes and shock in his eyes, you see him have to rip out a power stone hit just to knock her back. Not knock her down, knock her back, which also was probably a mistake given that she has the energy absorption capabilities that she has.
yeah, because the moment she got back to him, it was pretty much over for him. I'm gonna say that she probably would have just ripped his arm off.
Yeah, which that point actually led into probably the lowest point of the movie for me, which I loved and hated. It was one of those weird points for me. Is you have Carol going across the field with the Infinity Gauntlet, and it's like, well, how are you going to get it there? And that's coming from Spider-Man, who's like the kid. Oh, she's not alone, and there's every female superhero on the field helping her out, from Valkyrie to Rescue to Shuri, which is Black Panther's brother, for those who don't know, to Okoye,
Sister.
sister. Thank you, because that would have been awkward otherwise. You have Okoye, who is the head of, I can't remember
The
the name of
guard.
Black Panther. Yes, the guards for Black Panther, who have a specific name I can't remember, which I enjoyed. I thoroughly enjoyed it, being a guy that reads comics like A-Force, which is an all-female team. But the flip side of that coin was it felt a little bit shoehorned of them showing up and then that happening versus it being a more organic growth of Carol crossing the field and then like you see Spider-Man trying to keep up of how are we going to get this across as things start trying to pile on her and then say, you see a blast from Shuri. Oh, don't worry. Okoye comes in and stabs something the next few meters in. She's not alone. And then Scarlet Witch being Scarlet Witch.
Yeah. Well, I again, I was caught up in the spectacle of it. I know you saw it more times than I did that week, so you got a chance to,
Which is why I got a
yeah,
chance to thoroughly break
to
it
pick
down.
up on it a little bit more. Yeah. But from somebody that just saw it once and got caught up in the spectacle of all of it, I didn't really notice that. So I think a lot of people probably didn't notice that until later. I'm sure other people have noticed that, and I'm sure it's been pointed out by now. But
Yes.
I think that, I mean, that did lead to the Iron Man scene. And I do want to say that that was the one thing that people have talked about, and I really kind of want to just touch on as we kind of wind this down, is that I love the fact that Thanos is like, I'm inevitable, and then the empty snap is there, and Tony's got the gauntlet, and he's just like, and I am Iron Man. And I
Yeah.
think that was the fitting way for him to make his exit, because even though I know Robert Downey Jr. did not actually want to say that line,
I was going to bring that up if you didn't.
but I still think it was the right way to go out for that character. And I think that moment, because the next moment when he's kind of laying there dying, um, and that whole scene with Spider-Man, which again it
The role reversal.
ripped your heart out. Um, I think that was just, it was sad and beautiful at the same time for just the way that it was shot and who was in that shot, and then just Pepper saying you can rest now.
To
Yeah.
quote one of the more famous cinematic movie lines across the ages, it ends where it began, which is, I am Iron Man.
Oh
I
yeah.
found it extremely soothing.
Oh yeah, no, I did. And I did.
I also found it ripping my heart out.
Yeah, of course. But I do want to say one thing. Even though there were no post-credit scenes, the one thing I did enjoy was the anvil hits at the end from the throwback to the original Iron Man.
Yeah, which I took as a symbolic for we're not done yet, we're still building.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, that's to be expected. I mean, I don't know what the future truly holds for this. I know what the licenses and on the business deals of everything is, but for where we are and for what they did with this film, I have to say it was absolutely spot on. They hit the nail on the head and they did a fantastic job. I can't, and like people that say to me, that asked me, and I was like, I can't recommend this enough to go see it. And if you've seen it, go see it again because there's stuff that you missed. I guarantee there's stuff that you missed. I think there was something like, there's so many Easter eggs in this film.
I didn't know about the Howard the Duck Easter egg
Right.
during the portal scene because I didn't look it up until after like that stuff until after my sixth viewing, which was my end one.
Right.
And I'll be honest, I thought I saw it on my fifth viewing, and I'm like, nah, I'm seeing things, and then I see it in the YouTube things of, hey, here's all the Easter eggs, and I'm like, oh shit.
Yep.
I still think I was just seeing things, but
Nope, they snuck them in there. But, well, I mean, I think that's gonna do it for this, for our deep dive into this. But I mean, we did cover a few things. There's a few things I want to talk about. So, Shira and I will definitely be back to discuss more on the impact of female superheroes, starting with Wonder Woman, which did open first, and then going to the significance of the Captain Marvel movie, because that does set some things. There are a lot of things out there that need to be discussed on that, and I think that, um,
for sure.
and I think that that's something that, without getting politically, like I don't want anybody to sit there and think that we're going to be on a political soapbox about that. But there are some things that I feel are relevant, like when people had the conversation about Black Panther and how that you know made African culture relevant to bringing it to giving it a new exposure to people. Again, I think that there is a lot of positives that we could take away from this, and we want to get into that, do another deep dive. And of course, as we said, there are some other deep dives we can do on some of the films that came before this. So like going into the original X-Men film, going into the original Spider-Man film. We'll be doing more of these podcasts. And they'll always be with Shiro, I think, because Shiro and I just generally share a passion for the comic universes that are out there.
I
And
appreciate that.
yeah, so I would like to say this. Once again, I'd like to thank you, Shiro, for being a guest, as always. I appreciate that. And I really think that, anybody, once again, that hasn't seen this, or, maybe you're have missed out on seeing some of the movies. The one thing about this movie that does more than anything else is make you want to go back and watch some of the other films. And I
For
know,
sure.
I did. So, once again, Shiro, thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to say?
Thank you for having me. Once again, we have on July 2nd, Spider-Man Far From Home. And for those who are interested, I believe it's June 4th or something like that for the next Wonder Woman. Other than that, stay classy, San Francisco.
All right, and with that being said, we will be back with another episode of the Mel Show Podcast very soon. I still have some that are in the final stages of the editing process with everything that's going on, so you can expect to see those within the next couple of weeks as well. So, that being said, I appreciate you all spending some time here. Enjoy some of the videos that we have in the backlog, and I'll see you soon. Mel out.